Good afternoon, everybody. This is Mike Viola, the organizer again. So we're going to get started. First and foremost, I'd like to thank you all for attending today's webinar regarding the new OSHA crane operator rule. This is a rule that has been a long time coming and finally looks like it's here. Our presenter today is Cameron Boots, Allied's Director of Risk Engineering. Cameron's a very passionate risk and safety professional. Cameron's other bona fides include being Vice President of the American Society of Safety Professionals, a certified safety professional by the Board of Certified Safety Professionals, and a mobile crane and rigging inspector. Now, before we get underway, there's just a couple housekeeping items I'd like to mention. First, everybody besides the presenter is muted, so if you have a question, please type it in the question box within the control panel on the upper right-hand side of your screen. You can also collapse the control panel if need be so it doesn't interfere with your view of the webinar. We will address any questions at the end of the presentation. And second, we will be recording this webinar. We'll make it publicly available for anybody who would like to share it or view it again on our blog site and on our social media pages. So if you don't already follow those pages, please go ahead and like us or follow us on Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, and our blog page as well on our website. So without any further delay, I'm going to pass things over to Cameron.
All right, thank you very much, Mike. And hold on just a sec, folks. We bumped it out of presentation mode. There we go. All right, thank you everybody for joining us this afternoon and taking some time out of your schedule to cover OSHA's new crane rule. As Mike said, my name's Cameron, and I am with I'm with Allied Insurance Brokers, where we specifically focus on crane companies and scaffold companies as well. And then with that, we work with heavy haul companies and rigging companies. So today, what we're going to discuss the rule being proposed by OSHA in regards to crane operators. Now, those of you that are involved with the industry know that this has been going back and forth for some time, almost probably around 10 years. So we are going to cover the layman's terms behind that, and we're going to give you the key information that you need to know instead of diving into the weeds from a lot of the back and forth arguments. Once we cover that, we're going to go into some key points on how you can understand OSHA better. So we're specifically going to cover points that if you're ever involved with an inspection, an OSHA regulations being defined to you, you have better understanding of what that means and the specific rule that's being proposed. From there, we're going to discuss how capacity of cranes and employer evaluations play into effect with the crane rule, as well as where small cranes specifically fit into the rule, who pays for the crane certifications, when the rule will be effective, OSHA's 3 big words that'll help you better understand the proposed rules that will be implemented into the final rule, as well to our recommendations of how to efficiently qualify your crane operators. So without further ado, let's jump into the rule being proposed. So the exact verbiage that OSHA used for this proposal was the cranes and derricks in construction operator certification extension, and that was proposed in 2010 to ensure that all crane operators are certified. Now, the big quote that was pulled from the proposal that caused a lot of argument and a lot of debate is listed here in front of you, and that is: an operator will be deemed qualified to operate a particular piece of equipment if the operator is certified for the specific type and capacity of the equipment of operation. So basically what this means is when they get their CCO or their CIC card from the certification body, that is only specific to the piece of equipment, depending on the size and the type. Now, as you can imagine, that's going to cause a lot of arguments, definitely. So this has been argued, and this has been corrected, which is what we're going to go into. And I mean, if you can imagine, crane companies nowadays, they have cranes from anywhere from 30 tons to 500 to even 1,000 to 1,200 tons. So you can imagine the headache it would be for the crane industry if every single operator had to have a different endorsement to their certification to run different size and types of cranes. So before we go into the proposed changes to make our lives a little bit easier, we're going to do a little OSHA 101 crash course of 3 big definitions that I would like you all to remember. Not only this will help you with this rule, but it's going to help you with anything as you're moving forward to be able to depict what OSHA means by that. The first point that I would like to cover is the general duty clause. This is basically the clause that OSHA is formed around in any situation that there is not a clear definition of. It's going to fall back to the general duty clause, which basically states that the employer has to provide the employee a workplace that is free from hazards. So it's pretty self-explanatory, and as you can imagine some specific events that this can definitely come into play. Now, the question that we have been getting recently has basically been, hey, you know what, Cam? I'm a union-run crane operation, and I get all of my operators certified through the union halls. So when this rule goes into effect, that's still going to be the case, right? Well, yes and no. So for example, your union hall might give them their certification, but in the rules of qualification, when you rely on the general duty clause, it's always going to fall on the employer to do that and not necessarily the union hall, because it's the employer's responsibility to provide a hazard-free workplace to the employee. So remember that definition. The second definition is a competent person. Basically, the definition of a competent person is one who is able to identify hazards and can take the prompt corrective measures to eliminate them. Now, definitely training helps you become a competent person, but the employer will name you a competent person. It's all up to the employer. That's really the theme behind OSHA. Everything's going to be put on the employer as far as accountability. So the third definition I would like you to memorize is a qualified person. Now, you're going to see this one come up multiple times in this presentation, and specifically with the crane rule itself. So a qualified person is any person that is recognized by a degree, extensive knowledge, or professional standing, and they've successfully demonstrated the ability to solve and resolve problems. And that's specific to whatever work that they are conducting at that time. So a competent person identifies hazards. The qualified person solves and resolves the problems themselves. So a qualified person is a little bit more extensive in layman's terms than a competent person. So from the quote that I pulled out from the initial rule on a couple slides ago, it mentioned capacity and how the capacity will be determined on the certification. Well, that has been thrown out in the revised proposal. So basically, OSHA is unaware of any direct evidence establishing a safety benefit for requiring certification by capacity. Now, to me, this is, I really like this personally, mainly because you get the certification, you're not tied to the specific crane to operate, but in response to throwing out the capacity, the one thing that they have done is they've added the employer evaluation. So the employer evaluation is now in. And basically what that means, to become qualified, an operator not only has to be certified, but then the employer has to evaluate based off of the specific task, the specific type of crane, if that employee then passes to become qualified. So the key difference between this proposal and the existing standard is that the proposal would permanently maintain the employer's duty to evaluate operators. So again, OSHA has pushed this back on to the employers themselves. All right, so to answer the question about smaller cranes, because there was always the debate, the operators need to be certified for the smaller cranes within the 5 to 35,000 pound capacity. The answer is the rule still applies, yes. The only time there will be an exception within this is when there's a crane where the manufacturer's capacity is about 2,000 pounds. That is when you're gonna, if that's the situation where those are the cranes or the side-loaded cranes that you're operating, then I would consult the manufacturer as well as get in contact with your insurance consultant or OSHA themselves to clarify. But as far as smaller cranes within this range, yes, the rule will still apply for crane operators. So the big question, when will the rule be effective? So the date for the final ruling is still set for November 8th, which happens to be next week. But the big question is, can OSHA get this proposed rule into a final rule in time? That's basically the capacity issue as well as the evaluation endorsement as well. And the answer, OSHA says that's very unlikely. So what has happened is an additional 6 months have been requested, which technically pushes this to April 8th of 2019. But the point to remember is what will happen on November 8th of 2018? Well, this is completely up to OSHA. And most likely what's going to happen is this is going to be a no enforcement order, which means it's going to go into effect necessarily on November 8th, but it will not be enforced. So you cannot receive a violation until April 8th of 2019. It's very similar to the electronic logging devicing rule, where last year that went into effect in December, but it's not being enforced until 2019. So it's a difference between rules going into effect versus when they're going to be enforced. So we went over the OSHA 101 definitions that I want you to remember. Now the three big words that play a role here in regards to the new crane rule is certification, licensing, and qualification. Now these always get confused, so we're going to give a basic breakdown of all three, but they're frequently misunderstood and they are not the same. So currently, an operator must meet one of these items, currently without the law. On November 8th, an operator must meet two of these items. So specifically, if they're not within a licensed area or a licensed state or a specific licensed city like New York City, they will need the certification plus the qualification. And then, like I mentioned, some states and cities, an operator must meet all three requirements. Now, we're going to dive into all three of these, and I know you guys already probably have some question about the licensing side, so we're going to get to that in a couple slides. But first, we're going to cover the certification. Now, OSHA requires an accredited certification. The certification does not have to be issued by a third party. This means that it doesn't have to be issued by CIC or CCO specifically. It could be issued by the employer itself. We're going to get into the steps behind that of how to do that, though it's not necessarily recommended. For a testing organization to be considered accredited, though, they have to be a nationally recognized accredited agency. So this means they have to go through the practical examinations, test administrations, the grading, the facilities, all have to go through and become nationally accredited. So for example, CCO and CIC are two top ones. There's a couple other ones that you can do more research on, but those are the two top that most crane companies have already been getting their operators certified by. If you choose to do the certification in-house, those certifications would not be transferable if that employee were to leave that employer. Now, if you choose to do that, you have to go through almost similar auditing processes that a nationally recognized accredited agency would have to go through, and everything would have to be tested, everything would have to be audited again, yada, 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 yada. I personally don't recommend that. And the reasoning why is if an incident were to happen, OSHA per se already knows the credentials behind the third party nationally recognized accrediting agency. So they're going to point the finger and they're going to dive into how you certified operators in-house. It can be done. Don't get me wrong, but it's highly, I highly unrecommend that situation. So licensing. So there are no federal licensing requirements by OSHA. There are state and city licensing requirements. So right now there are 15 states and 6 cities that have licensing requirements. Now, these requirements vary widely. Some require a written examination, some require medical tests, practical, it all varies. But the big thing to realize is none of these licenses are transferable between the states that require licenses. So if you get your specific required license in Chicago, you can't necessarily utilize that in New York City without having New York City's required licenses. So here are the states and the cities that are involved with those required licenses. Now, some of you might look and see like, oh, you know, my state's on here and I didn't realize that I had required licensing. And one of the reasons behind that is some specific states, their licensing requirements are just that you need to go get an accredited certification. You need to go get your CCO. You need to go get your CIC. That could already be their specific licensing requirement. Pennsylvania, knowing Pennsylvania, that's one of Pennsylvania's. And then when you get into the specific cities, obviously New York City being the big outlier, that gets into even more licensing requirements. Then as you can see, Maryland being highlighted right now, the only licensing requirement for Maryland is for tower cranes. So the last key word that I would like to cover is qualification. So all crane operators must be qualified and they must meet OSHA's definition of a qualified person, which I'm going to put that back up that we went over before. And the big thing to realize is there are no official standards or protocols in use that determine a crane operator's ability. So that is not necessarily into effect yet. I don't see them doing that. And the main reasoning as to why I wouldn't want that is every job's different. Every area is different. A crane operator operating in the middle of winter up in Minnesota is going to have different ability and exposures than a crane operator in South Texas in the middle of summer. So I prefer that is on the employer to determine a crane operator's ability through their protocols and standards. Now, towards the end, we're going to give some recommendations that we like. If you would like to incorporate that within your evaluation process, you're more than welcome to. So, how to efficiently qualify your crane operators. We're going to use a simple equation. This was thought of by NCCCO as well as some SCNRA members, and I think it's like one of the most relevant equations, and it's very easy to comprehend. And that is certification plus evaluation equals qualification. You know, I got a little bit of a test here, so feel free to answer it in the question box. But the crane that you see in the background, I know it's a cool CGI image, but with what it's doing and being that it's rigged and it's holding the load of qualification, is there anything wrong as you are evaluating that crane that there is something missing there? I'll give you a couple seconds. I see a bunch of answers rolling in. Yes, and it looks like everybody got it. The outriggers aren't out. It's just sitting on the tires. So that is a good job. You're already picking up the role, and we're already becoming evaluators, I see. So again, from the equation, step one, get your operator certified. If you haven't already, no matter what OSHA depends on, if they add a 6-month extension for enforcement, if you haven't already, I do truly recommend doing this now, because even from an insurance perspective, a lot of carriers are already requiring it. So it doesn't hurt to have that in your operator's back pocket. Number two, evaluate the crane operator. Like we said, there are no specific rules, regulations, or guidance for the evaluation yet. It's going to be left to the employer. So what I recommend is getting your employee, whether it's your general manager, superintendent, one of your most experienced crane operators, get someone that has a lot of experience on the practical end, has extensive training, maybe has gone through some extracurricular activities in regards to the crane space, to be your evaluator, and definitely get their input of how they would like to do it and questions that they'd want to include. And another big thing is, once you create your evaluation form, you can always improve it. Don't just keep it like a standard JSA and just check. Always improve it as something changes, as the temperatures change. Make sure that they know what stable ground's like if it's cold, something like that specifically. So how to evaluate your employees specifically. We just started touching base on that, but rely on OSHA's definition of a qualified person. If you've noticed from this presentation, it's probably the third or fourth time I've mentioned that. And if you can take one big key piece from this presentation, it's the definition of a qualified person when it comes to evaluating your employees. So a crane operator must have sufficient knowledge and ability to properly operate the specific equipment. So they need the ability to perform pre-shift inspections, understand the crane setup, the ability to read and interpret a load chart, has read and understands the manufacturer's instructions, understands how to calculate the equipment's net hook capacity, familiar with the locations, rules, and regulations. If you are in Nevada and you're going to do work in California, make sure you know that there are definitely new rules and regulations. Or if you're in New Jersey and you're going to go into the 5 boroughs of New York, yeah, that's a little bit more than just rules and regulations, but make sure your guys are familiar with that to make sure they're not just going to go across the state line to get back to the office quicker. The ability to operate the crane through witness practical application, and then big one, knowing when to stop operations. I mean, your operator could be the most experienced operator, but you want to make sure he has confidence. You want to make sure if there's a controlling entity that's saying, hey, you need to make that pick, that operator is confident. If it's not a safe environment, that he says, you know what, I'm not doing that. I'm stopping operations. That's also a big part of the evaluation, is evaluating that part. So we have some additional evaluation information as well. I'm not going to read off all of this. I'll let you guys read this. And we are going to we're going to send a follow-up to everybody after the webinar with all of this additional information to put it as a recommendation if you would like to add it to your evaluations. We're going to have a question and answer segment as well at the end of this webinar. And we are going to specifically answer your questions. If there are any questions that we do not get to, I will personally respond, and we all have your emails. We'll get in contact with you and we'll go over all of that. But OSHA has a big construction standard. That's without a doubt. And I mean, as a safety professional myself, I'll tell you straight up, I don't have every page of that memorized, nor will I ever have every page of that memorized. I know where to find it, and I know how to interpret how an OSHA inspector is going to look at something. And really, those 3 definitions I gave you at the beginning with the general duty clause, competent person, and qualified person will help you interpret and go through probably about 60 to 70% of what OSHA is, of how OSHA is viewing something. So I'd like to thank you all for attending. We didn't want to keep this too long because I know how busy everyone is in the afternoon. We wanted to hit the key points of what you need to know. If you have any questions, please, other questions outside of what we're going to answer here, please feel free to either give me a call or shoot me an email. I'd be happy to help. I'd be happy to discuss anything that you've come across, any new recent findings. If anything's recently been released that we might have missed, we'd be happy to hear, and we'd be happy to discuss. And one more image. Again, this crane does not have the outriggers out, but I'm sure you guys already know that since you've already went through the presentation. So now we're going to answer some questions, and we'll get those answered for you.
All right, thanks, Cam. I've been monitoring the questions as they've been rolling in, and I picked out a few of the most frequently asked ones. The first one is essentially, usually federal laws overrule any state or local laws. Why is it that in this instance that more local and state regulations overrule the federal regulations?
So that's a great question. Those of you that have been through any civics classes realize that yes, federal law usually overpowers state and local. In this situation, that is not the case because the federal law is the baseline in regards to safety and best practices. Now, some of the specific states, whether it's New York, whether it's New York City, whether it's Chicago, whether it's California, goes above and beyond the baseline OSHA regulation. Specifically, California, for example, has their own state OSHA agency, Cal OSHA, to go above and beyond the base standard. Good question.
Next question is, who is responsible for paying for the operator certification?
So that question has been asked a lot. So who's responsible for paying? And if you don't have the answer, and one of the reasons why I didn't necessarily put that in the presentation was, in your minds, from what we went over, where would that fall? And I'll answer that, but it goes back to the general duty clause that the employer must provide a safe workplace, and being a certified operator makes that a safe workplace. So that's still gonna fall to the employer, just like it's the employer's responsibility to provide PPE as well. So that's gonna be the employer's responsibility to pay for, unless, I mean, obviously there's situations, specific states, the union halls provide that, but it's still going, if they don't, it's gonna fall to the employer. Good question.
Okay, the next question that popped up a few times, what are the fines going to be for noncompliance?
So there's not specific fines just for the standard. It's gonna, I would rely back on the standard OSHA fines. So if it's a one-time offense, it could be from $7,000. Depending if it's willful, repeatable, stuff like that, it's going to increase. But one way that I would look at this, if you are a crane company, let's say you have 20 operators, and OSHA is on a job site where 2 of your cranes are there, and they see that 2 of your operators are not in line with the standard, the next question they're going to ask is, well, what about your other operators? So as you can see, those 2 instances of a $7,000 fine would add up to 14, and now they want to see all your other operators. So as you can see how that can snowball, and it can really get you. OSHA doesn't mind fining, and it can get out of hand. Great question.
Okay, and the last one we'll cover here is there a chance that this rule will be pushed back again?
Another popular question. As you know, as everyone knows from being in the industry, this being proposed in 2010, it was pushed back last year. I would say it's at the point where all of the final arguments have been made. There were no rebuttals. Yeah, it's probably going to take some time to implement it from November 8th to April 8th, but I see there just being a no enforcement rule. I don't see this being pushed back again, but you never know. Someone can come in from left field and completely squish something again. I wouldn't rely on having the mindset, oh, it's going to get pushed back again. At this point, if you don't have everything in line to get your operators qualified, or if they're not certified by an accredited agency, I would definitely take the steps to do that, because it's going to make your company best practice material, and that's what's moving forward within the industry. So we had a couple other questions. I'm going to answer those one-on-one. I'll reach out to everybody and we'll cover those. I'd like to thank everybody for joining us today on a webinar covering the new crane rule. If you guys, again, have any questions, feel free to give me a call and I'd be happy to help. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody, for attending. And once again, to get a copy of this recorded webinar, we will be sending it in emails, but we're also going to be posting it on our social media pages and a news page on our website. So please go to our Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, and the news page on our website, and feel free to follow us or subscribe. And you not only get this information, but also all kinds of great updates on Allied and the industries that we service. Thank you for everybody for attending, and we'll be in touch.